Do you have a quilt pattern that calls for partial seams and are wondering what to do? Let's learn that technique today. I'm Andy from True Blue Quilts, a place to enjoy, experiment, and excel as we quilt. Be sure to click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode of quilting tips and inspiration. Today we're going to construct a quilt block using partial seams. Let's get started.
So before we get to our detailed description of partial seams, I want to show you how some other basic quilt blocks are constructed. With any basic quilt block where you're adding borders, we know how to do that. Our first step is to match those first blocks, the greenish ones, to the center of our block or to our quilt. Let's say this is a whole quilt. You're going to add the borders on the two sides, and then you'll add the top and bottom rows to that and complete your quilt block. So we'd have two pieces that match the center of the block and then two different size pieces that would be added to the top and bottom. For a traditional log cabin, you have three different sizes of pieces that you're adding to that center. So the first piece is the exact same size as the center. Those are going to match up, line up, sew them together. Then you're going to rotate the block and add the second row and add the third row. The second and third pieces that you add to that log cabin center are the same size. So you've got a small piece that you add first, then two medium-sized pieces that you add next, and then you finish with that longest piece that's the full size of your block. And that is a traditional log cabin piecing technique. Then we get to partial seams. And partial seams, just like it sounds like, you're only sewing part of that seam. So let me show you how that works. One thing before we move on, you notice that all four of those pieces are the exact same size, and they're going to fit around that center block, whether it's a focus fabric, whether it's a medallion quilt that you're framing, a medallion block in your quilt, some kind of focus point there at the center of your block, and then you want four identical pieces around the edge. So to start with, we take our first piece and we're only going to sew part of that seam. So I'm starting at the center of my block and sewing to the outside edge that you can see noted there. Then I will add my second piece, and this time I can sew the complete seam. You see how it runs from top to bottom, all connected. I can sew those fabrics together. Add the third piece. Again, I have a full seam that I can work with. It perfectly lines up with the other pieces of fabric there. And my fourth piece gets added in the same way. Just make sure you fold that extra fabric from the first step out of the way, and you can complete that. So then we have to go back to that partial seam that we started at the very beginning, and we need to finish that seam. So that's where the partial comes in. You sewed part of it at the beginning, and you're going to finish and sew part of it at the end for that first piece of fabric. So when would you need to use partial seams? Well, we use those seams when the border pieces don't exactly match. They're not the same size as the center of your block. You can see with this layout of half rectangle triangles that gives that tilted appearance of a square in a square. Those blocks don't exactly match up. We wouldn't want to cut those rectangles in half to make a piece start off the same size like we did with the log cabin or with those basic borders that I showed you at the first screen. So partial seams are necessary. We can add some more interest to our quilt blocks when things don't exactly match. And those partial seams are easy to work with, so I'd encourage you to add that to your quilting toolbox. Let's move on and see how this works with fabric, and then I will show you a completed quilt that uses partial seams.
I am ready to sew a quilt block with partial seams. I have a plain center square of fabric, and I'm going to be adding 4 border pieces around the edge. The border pieces are all the same size, but they're bigger than the center square. So to get started, I am going to line up the edges of my first border with the center square. And as I explained in the slideshow, I'm only going to sew half of that edge. So I sew to about there, and for this demonstration I'm going to finger press. So this edge is not completely sewn yet. Take out that thread, but I have a full edge there that will fit that second border piece. So I will get that lined up. I've got a few places where my seams intersect, so I want to pin those and make those intersections fit as nicely as possible. Second border is on. Now I will attach my third border. Same way it fits. It's exactly the same size as that center block with the border. For this last border, I want to keep this piece of fabric out of the way. That first border that I put on still has a tail, so I'm just going to pin that down so that I don't have any issues with that fabric. And here we get to the magical place of matching that first seam. So this border with my black and white pieces was the first piece I sewed on. I only sewed that small section. Now I have a full block that I'm ready to complete. So I line that up again, and I can just continue right across my original stitching line, right in line. It'll match up there, and I will have my block with kind of overlapping borders. Cleaning up some of those loose threads as I go. Ta-da! Here we have our finished block with partial seams. That center block floats in these different border sections that, especially with the twister blocks, there was no way to have that border continue around the corner without doing that partial seam. In the quilt variable winds that you see behind me, the center medallion is surrounded by different size borders. I used partial seams to get everything to fit. This technique allows the center to float among a variety of border sizes. After you've mastered partial seams, you can dazzle your friends with complicated looking blocks that are relatively easy to sew. This gives you another way to enjoy, experiment, and excel as you quilt. Thanks for joining me.
You can see more quilting with twister rulers and other tips and techniques from True Blue Quilts by clicking on the playlist below. I appreciate all my subscribers. You can click on the bell notification to get a reminder every Friday when new videos are posted.